Hello, welcome to the Queensland Forum for 2022. My name is Julie Stout. I'm a professor at Monash University and the Turner Institute of Brain and Mental Health. I'll start by thanking Kathy Holland and Sean Riley and the team at Huntington's Queensland for the invitation to speak with you today. I always love to come to Queensland and meet up with the community, and I've done that a couple of times and given a couple of talks there. Unfortunately, this year I wasn't able to travel just due to some medical procedure I have to have. So instead, I have to come to you by recording, and I'll be on to answer some questions at the end. But I wish you well. I hope you enjoy your day today, and I hope to be back with you next year. Thank you. Now, moving things along, I always start my talks with what is Huntington's disease because there are always new people who come into the forum, and it's important for everyone to kind of know and have a good understanding of the disease right from the get-go. So first thing I'll say is Huntington's disease is a rare disease. It's a genetic disease. It affects about 5 to 15 people per 100,000. It causes a progressive picture of symptoms. Usually it starts in adulthood, but it can start in children or it can start in late adulthood, like in older age. But the symptoms are progressive. There are sort of 3 types of symptoms. One is movement symptoms. One is personality or emotion types of symptoms or mood. And a third is thinking symptoms. I'm going to talk more about those on the next slide, so I'll leave that here. And I'll go to the next thing to know about Huntington's disease. I said it's a rare genetic disease. It's actually caused by a single gene, and that gene is passed through families by an affected parent. What's an affected parent? That's a person who is the parent who has the Huntington's disease gene. Now, I'll talk more about that as well in a couple of slides, so I'll move on from there. Next, I want to mention the fact that Huntington's disease is caused by changes to the brain. So the gene that's affected in Huntington's disease leads to changes in the brain. Initially, those changes are in the basal ganglia, which is an area of the brain. It's kind of in the middle, and this area of the brain is the area that first begins to be affected. It's really responsible for a lot of the symptoms we see. But as the disease progresses, and it progresses over many years, 10, 15, 20, even 25 years sometimes is how long people have symptoms. As the disease progresses, the effects in the brain of the Huntington's disease gene become more widespread, and they also begin to affect the cortex as well. So I mentioned that there were these 3 types of symptoms that are characteristic of Huntington's disease: the movements, the thinking, and the mood and emotion. So first I'll say something about the movements. So there are really sort of 2 main types of movement issues that arise in Huntington's disease. One is called chorea, and chorea are these abnormal movements they're called involuntary movements because they're movements that a person doesn't intend to make, but they just happen spontaneously. So you might see movements like this, or sometimes the hands moving around, in some cases even quite big movements. Sometimes you see it in the feet. Sometimes you see quite a lot of this chorea movement throughout the body. The other type of movement symptom you have is slowing. So with the disease, and as it progresses, people become slower in their movements. It's not so much that they have problems with their coordination, but they have problems with their speed of movement, and that's called bradykinesia, or slowed movement. So those are the 2 main types of symptoms that you see in Huntington's disease. They're called chorea, and they're called bradykinesia, or slowed movement. The second type of symptom that I mentioned already is the symptoms that affect mood and emotion. We know that many people with Huntington's disease experience a major depressive disorder or a major depressive episode. They often also have some anxiety. So these mood and emotion changes, sometimes they're just moodiness, sometimes it can be irritability and things like that, also apathy, but in other cases they can actually be a major depressive episode, or what we would call a clinically significant episode of depression. And when a person has depression and they have Huntington's disease, or if they have the gene, or even if they don't have the gene, anyone who has depression really should have their depression treated. So depression is a very treatable kind of symptom. Any other kind of mood disorder tends to be also treatable. Anxiety is very treatable as well. So these are things that you can talk to your GP about, your neurologist, your psychiatrist. Is a really important part of the disease of Huntington's disease, and it's something that we really want to see treated. The third type of symptom that we see in Huntington's disease are changes in thinking. These are changes in thinking and memory. They are very, very subtle, very minimal in the beginning of the disease, but as the disease develops, they get worse and worse. So, for example, what you can see are people with Huntington's disease often might have trouble thinking of the word that they want to use. They might have trouble with their memory. Usually it's not that they can't remember something at all, like say Alzheimer's disease. In Alzheimer's disease, people completely forget information. But in Huntington's disease, what seems to be the case is that it's more that they have trouble accessing information that they do know. So, for example, if you said to someone with Huntington's disease, "What did you have for dinner last night?" they may not be able to remember. They might be able not be able to remember and tell you what they had. But if you said, "Did you have lamb chops last night, or spaghetti, or a salad?" then they'll be able to remember, "Oh yes, I had the lamb chops." So this is a kind of memory problem, which is a problem of just being able to access the information that you know. That's something that becomes very inefficient in Huntington's disease. And like I said, that's quite different than in a dementia like Alzheimer's disease, because if you ask them, did they have lamb chops or a salad or a spaghetti, they actually wouldn't, they would just have to guess. They wouldn't really have any memory of what happened last night. So this is a big difference between Huntington's disease and some of the a more common form of neurodegenerative disease, which is Alzheimer's disease, much more common than Huntington's. So we have these different three types of movements of symptoms: movement symptoms, we have thinking symptoms, we have mood and emotion symptoms. I mentioned to you that when people have mood and emotion symptoms, they should try to get those symptoms treated. It's the same thing with movements. The movement symptoms can often be treated as well if they're bothersome. Many people with Huntington's do have a little bit of chorea, and they don't really find it very bothersome, and so they don't get it treated, and that's really fine. It doesn't have any impact on the disease or its progression or anything. Those can go untreated if that's what they wish. The bradykinesia or slowing of movement, that's not something we have any treatments for at the moment. And similarly, with the thinking problems in Huntington's disease, we don't have any treatments for that at the moment either. Although there are some drugs being tried for that, and we might hope that maybe a solution will be found for that in the course of the next few or several years. So Huntington's disease is a complex disease because of the fact that it affects so many different aspects of our behavior: the movements, the thinking, and the mood and the emotion. And so this is one of the reasons that many people find it challenging to experience Huntington's disease, and is one of the reasons that people like me are so compelled to try and work in this field to try and find solutions for the symptoms that people do have, but also to find ways that we might be able to treat the disease, slow its progression, and hopefully prevent it from happening in the future. Now, I said that I would talk a little bit about the inheritance of the Huntington's disease gene. If you inherit the Huntington's disease gene, it's important to know that that does mean that you will get the disease. So Huntington's disease is called an autosomal dominant disease with full penetrance. It is a disease that is passed down from parent to child, and then from that child, when they grow up to be a parent, then they can pass it down to their child. And each child of a person who has Huntington's disease has a 50% chance of inheriting that Huntington's disease gene. So here you have a diagram to demonstrate that. Let me just get my cursor to be able to show you that. Okay, so here, just so that you understand how this diagram works, this is the first generation, then this is their children, that next generation, then the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren. This is just an illustrative example. So how this diagram works, this is called just a genetic tree. You have females shown in circles, males shown in squares, and an unaffected parent, that means a parent that does not have the Huntington's disease gene, is shown in gray, whereas people who have the Huntington's disease gene are shown in this dark red color, or brown, or whatever it is. So you can see in this couple here, these are parents, a woman who is shown in light gray. She doesn't have the Huntington's disease gene. On the other hand, the male shown at the same level in the same generation, shown in dark red in the square, he does have the Huntington's disease gene. And these two people, they have children. They have a girl, a boy, and another boy. Their girl inherits the Huntington's disease gene. This boy also inherits the Huntington's disease gene, and this boy does not inherit the Huntington's disease gene. Okay, now each one of those children in this case, they all have partners. This is a girl with, as I said, with the Huntington's disease gene. The partner that she has is a male with no Huntington's disease gene, and they have two children themselves. They end up having one girl who does not have the disease gene and one boy who does have the Huntington's disease gene. Okay, so in this generation, it's passed from this male to this female, and then to this male. And you can see they also have some people that it didn't get passed to. Now here's another example. This is, again, the male passing on this gene to this male. This male has a partner who's an unaffected female. The two of them have one child. That one child has the Huntington's disease gene. They partner with a person a male who does not have the Huntington's disease gene. Then those two people have three children. They end up having a girl with the HD gene, a boy without the HD gene, and then two other boys that do have the HD gene. So you can see in this family, what happens is it's passed from this male, to this female, and then to these children. One female and two males. And this is an important example too, because in this case what you see is that this unaffected female and affected male, they have this third child. That child does not have the Huntington's disease gene, despite the fact that they have a parent that has HD. That's just by chance that they didn't inherit that gene. They also partner with an unaffected person as a female, and the two of them have two children, so neither one of them gets HD, and neither one of these children gets HD, because HD, it can't be passed down from this father because this father didn't inherit the HD gene. Okay, so this is a good example because it shows you all the different things that can happen. And I said there's a 50% chance. That doesn't mean that 50% of the children actually get HD. It depends on just chance, so that's why, you have to kind of look at a family diagram like this. And just because, say, the first child inherits the gene, it doesn't have any impact on whether their next child will have the HD gene as well. Each child is kind of an independent example. Now, I just want to show you this picture of Nancy Wexler. I did show this to you last year as well. Nancy Wexler is a kind of a hero of the Huntington's disease field. She is a person who's from a Huntington's disease family herself. Her mother had Huntington's disease. Her father and mother had two children. They had Nancy and her sister Alice. Both of them grew up and did kind of great things in the field of Huntington's disease. Nancy Wexler is the person who is really responsible for leading the team that ended up identifying the gene for Huntington's disease in 1993. This is a diagram. You can see it's kind of a poor picture, but it still shows you those same family trees that I was just showing you in the last slide are shown here. And here what she's done is she's taped up on paper. She's printed these out on paper and taped them up around this room to study the transmission of the Huntington's disease gene across a whole community. And this work was done in Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela, a very important place for Huntington's disease because it was the families of Lake Maracaibo and the delegation of scientists and doctors that was led by Nancy Wexler that was able to identify the exact locus of the gene that causes Huntington's disease in 1993. Now, you might think, well, we've known about this gene since 1993. And by the way, it's also important to know that back in 1993, we were just learning how to sequence the human genome. There weren't very many human genomes that had been sequenced at that time. So the Huntington's disease gene was one of the very first beneficiaries of this new technology to sequence our DNA and identify our genes. So this was back in 1993, nearly 30 years ago. And I think at that time, I was around at that time. I didn't go to Lake Maracaibo. I was just getting started in the field. And we all felt so optimistic in 1993 when the gene for HD was identified because we thought that that meant it was the first step toward a cure. Now, I still say it's the first step toward a cure, but nearly 30 years later, we still don't have any disease modifying, any treatments that can slow down the progression of the disease or prevent it from happening in a person who has the HD gene. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about that story as we go on. So that was my first part of my presentation, and that part is really about what is Huntington's disease, and I always like to talk about that first because I think sometimes people who know a lot about Huntington's disease might learn a little something from it, but also I like to welcome new people by making sure that they have some information about HD as well. So that's my first part, what is Huntington's disease, and the next thing I'm going to talk about here is about finding treatments for HD. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to give you a bit of an update on progress. Okay, now this is unfortunately this is a slide from a scientific paper, and it's not that easy to understand, but I do want to explain it because I think it's really important for the audience to understand how we look at what we're trying to do in finding treatments or a cure for HD. Okay, so this is a paper that was published just last year, and it really laid out a model for how we think about what treatments can do for a disease like Huntington's disease. And the first thing I want to do is I want to highlight over here, you can see I've got two different headings here. One is symptom modification and one is disease modification. So in the world of finding drugs to treat illnesses, we have sort of two different types of approaches. In one approach, rather than treating the disease itself, we are treating just some symptom. And a good example of that would be, let's say you have a cold. And then when you have a cold, your nose is runny, you have a bit of a cough, and so you take, some over-the-counter pill that helps to, dry up your nasal mucus. It helps to make it so that you don't cough as much. Now, if you take, like say a cough medicine or a cold pill, that cold pill isn't meant to make the cold virus go away. It doesn't really change how quickly you get better. It just helps to deal with the symptom. And the symptom is like the runny nose and the cough. Okay? So one type of approach when you're working on finding drugs to help people who are experiencing symptoms and have a disease is to find something that just makes the disease more tolerable. Okay, that's called a symptom modification approach. So symptom modification for Huntington's disease, that might look like, well, maybe it's a treatment to reduce the movement symptoms. Yep, we actually have a couple of those. Maybe it's a treatment that reduces the cognitive symptoms. We don't have any of those yet, but some people are trying to develop some. That would be really great. If we could get some, that would be really good. Do we have any treatments for the mood or the emotional dysregulation problem? That would be like the irritability, the depression, that sort of thing. Yep, we actually have some things for those types of symptoms. So people can get treatments like an antidepressant treatment or an anti-anxiety treatment or something like that. And so we have some symptom modification treatments. We have them for movement and we have them for emotions. We don't really have anything for cognitive symptoms. People are trying that, But the good thing is that makes living with Huntington's disease more doable, more comfortable, more, makes it better, makes the symptoms less bothersome. But what they don't do is they don't actually modify the course of disease. So the second type of drug that you can develop for a disease is called a disease modification drug or a disease modifying drug. And that's what this diagram is about. So a disease modifying drug is an approach where you actually try to change the course of the disease. So in Huntington's disease, which normally has its onset usually in adulthood, what you might do is you might try and delay the onset of Huntington's disease. Say if a person was going to get HD at 35 years old, what if you could delay that for 30 years? Then they would get HD at 65 years old, and that's a pretty good outcome. It's not cure, but it's a very helpful type of an outcome. Now, that's disease modification. Another thing you might have is you might try and find a treatment that, in a person who has the Huntington's disease gene, allows them to live out their full lifespan without ever developing Huntington's disease itself. That's another type of a treatment. These are both examples of disease modification approaches. And what drug developer, so there's a lot of emphasis on trying to get disease modification, but it's much harder than getting symptom modification. So we've got some symptom modification approaches, some treatments, but we have no disease modifying approaches. Now, not only do we not have disease modifying treatments for Huntington's disease, they really almost entirely do not exist for any other neurodegenerative disease either. Okay, now you might have heard some news in the press in the past year or two. There's been a couple of drugs that have been really touted as being really important drugs for Alzheimer's disease. They have been approved, for example, by the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. And so this was really big news. But unfortunately, the drugs were not as great as we would have liked, so there is some evidence in a narrow range of people with Alzheimer's disease that maybe they do get better from taking this drug. But the broad category of all people with Alzheimer's disease, which is a very large number across the world, do not really benefit. So you might say maybe in Alzheimer's disease there's a little bit of progress there that has been popularized in the news, but we really don't see that that's really the big solution. But it actually is a big important key to the future, because I think even though it's a small start, it might lead to something. And furthermore, it might also lead to something for Huntington's disease, but we don't know yet. We don't have anything for HD yet that is really showing a good disease modifying effect. Okay, now what I want to highlight to you, and this diagram actually says it, but I might not explain the whole thing in detail. But what I want to explain to you is that when we try and get disease modification, there are a couple of different things that we can do. How I was just saying that in Alzheimer's disease, the drug wasn't that great. Well, what that was what's shown here. It's called a mildly effective drug. So it was a little bit effective, but not very effective. And so what this diagram shows is what you would have if you had a mildly effective drug or a moderately effective drug. What we'd love to have is a really highly effective drug, and that would be great. But let's trace what happens here. So this is the course of Huntington's disease. And people start out and they function normally. They don't have any Huntington's disease symptoms. They're for all intents and purposes, they just seem like a normal, healthy person. And then at some point in their life, depending on, different ages for different people, they begin to show very gradual and subtle signs. And we might call that the premotor period or the pre-symptomatic period. And that's not the point at which a diagnosis occurs. Okay, you don't get a diagnosis just by having an HD gene. You have to actually have symptoms. And this is where the symptoms are kind of starting to creep up, but they're not quite significant enough in order for a doctor to say, yes, you have Huntington's. Okay, so that's called the pre-symptomatic or the pre-motor period. But then at some point, gradually across time, those very subtle symptoms develop more and more. Maybe it's the movements, maybe it's the cognition, maybe it's the mood. And then you have overt clinical symptoms. That's when you get the disease, so the disease diagnosis that it happened here, and then that would progress across time. And the way you can think about that is that the brain loses neurons across time as well. So that's what this blue line shows here. And what you would have if you had a mildly effective drug is that's shown in the dotted blue line. That's this idea that rather than this quite significant slope of decline over the timeline, you can see this is a more gradual decline. The line is not going down as quickly. So you could have a mildly effective drug that you use in the period before they have any symptoms at all, and that would save a lot of the neurons, the brain cells that is. You could do that in once the premotor period starts, and that would save some brain cells and it would make the disease progress later. And you could do that even once people are diagnosed, and again the disease would be a bit later. Now, in a moderately effective drug, you can slow things down even more, and that's a really important opportunity. So this is the kind of thing that we're trying to do, is we're trying to find drugs, that, ideally would really have a major effect in Huntington's disease, but even if we can find a moderately or a minimally effective drug, then that gives us something to work with. So why don't we have anything now? Why is there no treatment to slow the disease of HD at the moment? Well, one reason is that these diseases are caused by biological changes, and we understand a lot of things about these biological changes, but we don't maybe have quite enough knowledge. So that's one important consideration. Another thing to say is that there are some drugs now that have been developed in HD that can reduce some of the biological changes that you have in the disease, but they don't actually improve the symptoms. And that's a problem, because for drugs to get approved and to get them into people after they've been developed, they actually must improve symptoms. So one of the questions we're asking right now is, why is it that if you can change some of the biology, you don't get improvements in people's symptoms? We don't know the answer to that yet, and that's something I and a lot of other people are working on. So at this point, what we have is a bit of a disconnect, because we know we can improve some of the biology, but we're not finding that that's yet translating to improved symptoms, and that's something we're working on. Now, I did want to mention to you that Huntington's disease clinical trials are really important, because this is how drugs get identified. Right now, there are there are actually 5 drug trials that are going on in Australia. All these drug trials are international trials. We always try and get them to come to Australia and have clinical trial sites here. You can see there's one that's going to start up in Brisbane soon. There are a few in Sydney and Melbourne, and there are a couple that are also in Perth. There's actually 5 now, but they're in different stages of either getting ready to start or starting. So this is a really good thing, because many people, like in the community, are very interested in participating in these clinical trials and being part of the solution to try and find a cure. But internationally, I want to tell you that there are many more trials that are underway. They don't all come to Australia and get tested here, but there's various progress. So in the preclinical phase, this is when they're just developing drugs and trying them on animal models. There are many more than 20 trials going on. In the early phase trials, there's about 20 that are going on, but in the most advanced stage of drug discovery, the phase 3 trial, there are less than 5. So there's just a handful of these that are going on anywhere in the world at the moment. So this is an important, watch this space. These numbers tend to kind of grow, but they've been, there's been a lot of work in HD, and it's continuing, and many companies are very invested into trying to find a treatment for HD. Now, I did want to spend a little bit of time talking to you about Australian research opportunities and opportunities for participation. We have the Huntington's Disease Registry. It's called the Map-HD Registry. Huntington's Queensland has been a fabulous supporter of this effort, and you might have seen these posters around their office. And this is a registry which is for people who either have HD or their care partners. We're interested in learning about how care partners or carers of people with HD, how they're doing, and other family members. So that's something that's going on. And I want to tell you a little bit about why you might sign up for the Huntington's disease Map-HD Registry. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as time goes on. We so far have 109 people. We've been going less than a year, and there are 109 people across Australia so far in this registry. So this is really helpful, and we hope to get a couple thousand eventually. So this just shows you a little bit about the Map-HD Registry and how you consent for it. You actually go online. If you have any questions about it, people at Huntington's Queensland can help you with it. You can also contact my team directly, and we'll also help. So this shows you that you can be an adult and you can be providing your own consent, and any adults who can consent, they have to consent themselves to be able to participate in the registry. You can also consent if you're a care partner. You can consent for another adult. Let's say you're the care partner of an adult who is has very severe Huntington's disease. If they want to be a participant, then they may possibly need you to consent on their behalf. They may have trouble understanding the complex consent form that we had to use, and so in that case they might need you to be their consenting adult. There's also another type of consent, which is for a parent or a legal guardian to consent on behalf of their minor aged child, a child under 18 years old. Now back to over here, I want to point something out. You can participate, as I said, if you are a person with Huntington's, or you're a person who has the gene for HD, or maybe you're from an HD family, you don't know if you have the gene, you could participate. Or let's say you're the carer of a person who has Huntington's disease and they can consent for themselves, but you would also like to participate and give your information. Those are really important participants for us as well. And you can see here we have the participant we have an opportunity, and that would be the consent form you would use. It's called adult providing own consent if you want to participate regardless of your HD status. So I want to encourage people to sign up to the registry. It's available, it's up and operating, and we can help you do it. Now we are also conducting a prevalence study, and I'll just jump down to this part down here. The prevalence study is a study that's just using existing databases from clinics, genetic testing, and the state associations like Huntington's Queensland, and we're working to put all that together to come up with some estimates of the prevalence across Australia of Huntington's disease. And why do we need to do that? Well, these are the studies that we have so far for the different states. Some of them are as old as 1955. Queensland, I think the latest data is from 1958. We don't really know, but that said that there were 2.3 per 100,000. We think that that number should be higher, and obviously data from 1958 is insufficient. And you can see there's old data, some of it's somewhat newer, but we don't have any time point at which we've taken a look across the entire country and looked for all of Australia, what's the prevalence of this disease. And we think it's going to probably be something like about 10 per 100,000, but we don't know until we do this study. So that prevalence study is going on, and we're working state by state to try and establish the numbers. Now, why are prevalence estimates needed, and why do we need the registry? Okay, the first thing is we have we need the knowledge about the number of people and their distribution across Australia of those people who are affected by HD. Why do we need that? Because that affects things like government funding for medical care and research. Okay. We also need to understand whether there are pockets or regions that have greater prevalence of HD, and we know from previous research across the world that oftentimes there's a part of a state or a part of the country that has more HD. We need to know where that would be if that is happening in HD in Australia, so that more resources can get to those people. We can also use this data to raise government awareness to address the unmet needs and the disparity between how many people there are and what services are available. And this is a huge problem, by the way, in Queensland. In Queensland, you have really very limited amount of clinical resources. In other words, there are too few doctors that have too few appointments available for all the people in Queensland who have HD, but we actually don't have the numbers to be able to support a really solid appeal to the government. And furthermore, the final reason why we need these type of numbers is that if a drug does get identified, we need to have these numbers so that we can make an appeal to the government, or we can support an appeal to the government to approve a drug and then get it onto the PBA, or get it onto the PBS, which is the committee that's called the PBA. So then PBA, when they're considering whether to pay for a drug, they want to know how many people have the disease, how much are they, what kind of services do they need, how can we get the treatments to them, and we don't have enough of a picture of HD across Australia to be able to do that. So I'm going to shift gears and I'm going to just talk about one last thing, which is the brain-gut connections in Huntington's disease. This is just a big project in my lab. It's being led by Eva Glickman-Johnston, who's a neuropsychologist who's working with us. She has a keen interest in this topic, and I think all of you have been hearing in the news these things about Huntington's, about the brain-gut interaction. The brain actually sends signals to the gut sends signals to the brain. They use a lot of the same type of chemicals, and now this is kind of like a new frontier in science. And so this is something we're investigating in Huntington's disease because we think there's some possibility that, maybe by even treating the gut in HD, we can treat Huntington's disease. So let's have a look at this. The project is recruiting for subjects. You can do it from home, and so you don't have to travel to do it. You get reimbursed $40 if you do it. If you do it, we provide you with a kit, and you have to provide a stool sample. It's not that difficult. Most of us have to do that if we're of a certain age group anyway, every once in a while for the government. So you then fill out a bit of a diary about any symptoms you have associated with your bowel. You do some cognitive tasks, and this is the contact information. But I'm sure if you also do ask Huntington's Queensland, they can provide you with that information as well. So that's the last of my slides. I'm going to stop and I'll say thank you. I can't take questions on the recording, obviously, but I'll be joining you to take any questions that you might have. So thanks so much for your attention, and best wishes.